In retrospect, I probably should have made a guide on this first, since it is the deck that this format is named after. Oh well, let's remedy that now, shall we? As its name suggests, Goat Control is the premier control deck in this format, and for many years it was the most played deck in Goat format, taking up most of the top spots back in the actual event in 2005, as well as being top in many of the early tournaments when Goat was first revived in the 2010s. In fact, Chris Borovic's list was the standard bearer for decks in Goat for many years, and pretty much stayed that way until Exilion Universe was booted from the format. While the deck has fallen slightly since then, having been usurped from its top spot by Warrior and Chaos decks, it's still a force to be reckoned with within the meta, and is among not just the most powerful, but also one of the least linear in the format. In fact, this deck is considered by many to be one of the most skillful decks to master, and one of the greatest meta matches of all time, due to the variety of cards it runs. I can't wait to get started, so let's take a look. Let's begin this by talking about the combo that gives the deck its name, Scapegoat plus Metamorphosis. Now by itself, Scapegoat is an excellent tool for control decks in this format. Due to cards I'll discuss later, most Goat decks will not go wide, and often may only have one attacking monster at a time. As such, a card that puts 4 tokens on the battlefield can often slow an opponent down to a crawl for a turn or two, which gives you as a control player more time to build up your hand and resources to outgrind your opponent in the late game. In fact, this card is so good at slowing down aggressive strategies that it raises the values of cards like a Soda Priest and pretty much mandates any successful aggro deck have an out to it, such as Enraged Battleox in Beasts and Gravekeeper's Spear Soldier in Gravekeepers. However, as good as this card is by itself, it's nothing compared to the misery we can inflict on our opponents by combining it with Metamorphosis. If you're too young to remember this card, since it has been legal since the original Goat format, imagine if Instant Fusion was designed by the guy who made Sky Striker Immobilize Engage. By sacrificing a monster, this card allows us to summon any fusion monster from the extra deck with the same level, and that's it. No attack or effect restrictions, and you get to keep the monster when the turn ends. In addition to summoning the boss monster we talk about, this card can also be used to trigger Sangan, get a free level 1 fusion with Sinister Serpent, and act as a removal spell when combined with Snatch Steal. However, most of the time we use Metamorphosis on a Goat token and summon the final part of this combo, Thousand Eyes Restrict. A level 1 fusion monster, Restrict is among the most powerful monsters in Goat format, and like Metamorphosis, it spent a lot of time post-Goat on the ban list. A few years too long, to be honest. Firstly, this card is a spellbinding circle for the entire board bar itself, which means that other than itself, no other monster can turn its battle position or attack while it's on the field. You thought Scapegoat was a good stall card? This card stalls more than an opposition party in the US Senate. In addition to this, Restrict also inherits the power of Relinquished to transform an opponent's monster into an equip card that increases Thousand Eyes attack and defense by the same as the monster it stole. These two effects combined make Restrict both a good proactive and reactive card, as it can be used to both lock down the field if your opponent hasn't got a big threat yet, or to remove any threat if it's been summoned afterwards. Also, as Restrict's Monster Steal turns the card into an equip card, effects that flip Restrict face down, like Book of Moon and Tsukiyomi, can turn the card into a repeatable removal piece, as you can use it to steal a monster, flip it down, then flip it back up again to steal another monster. Moving on from Restrict, let's look at the other powerful monsters in this deck, all of whom are big beaters with powerful abilities. Let's start with a card I'm sure will be a regular in this series, Blacklist Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning. I think I've mentioned this guy in every video I've made so far, and there's a reason. If your deck can run light and dark monsters, there's literally no reason to not run this card in this format. It could be argued that BLS, along with its thankfully banned partner in crime, Chaos Emperor Dragon, were the progenitors to the modern boss monsters of Yugioh, being easily summonable, huge monsters with effects so powerful that they took over the entire game if left unanswered. All BLS requires to be summoned is removing 1 light and 1 dark from the game, and then presto, you have a 3000 attack monster with 2 powerful effects. However, before even going there, I'll point out that this is the most powerful monster in terms of attack that is played in Goat, and it's not even that close, with the next most powerful monster being Dark Magician of Chaos, which is played in exactly 1 deck, and all the other big monsters of this format usually being 2400 or less. However, BLS is not just a dumb beater that's very stupidly easy to bring out, that wouldn't be nearly broken enough. He also has not one, but two abilities that combined with his oppressive stats, make him the most feared monster in GOAT format. Firstly, if he destroys a monster in battle, he can make a second attack each turn. This makes chopping through GOAT tokens a breeze, can allow a BLS top deck to clear a powerful board, and in the best case scenario can even cause an OTK when combined with cards like Ring of Destruction. But let's say for some reason you don't want to attack. Like let's say your opponent has a flip you don't want to trigger, or they got a restrict up. Well, in that case, BLS has another ability. By skipping his attack, he can remove one monster from play each turn, so even cards this guy can't out in battle aren't safe from him. In summary, if you come up against this guy, do whatever it takes to get him off the field quickly. Bomb him, shoot him with lightning, send a whole army after him, I don't care. Just kill him or you will lose very fast. Well, that's bye for now, BLS. I'm sure we'll see you again in the next video. After BLS, the next most powerful monster in this deck is Air Knight Parshaf. A 1 tribute monster, Air Knight has 1900 attack, which while low for a tribute monster, is made up for by two powerful effects. Firstly, he's a piercer, which as we've established is extremely powerful in this format given the prominence of Scapegoat, as well as the prominence of low defense flip monsters like Magician of Faith. Given Air Knight's stats, it's not uncommon for him to hit for between 1000 to 1500 or more damage when he attacks a monster like this, and when he does, that triggers his second effect, which allows us to draw a card upon inflicting damage. As said, GOAT Control is a control deck that wants to drag the game on as long as possible and outgrind their opponents, and so an effect like this that keeps our hand nice and full is always welcome in this deck. If you want, you can end your deck's big monster lineup here with 1 BLS and 2 Air Knight, which has been the standard in GOAT lists for some years. However, over time, many GOAT players have chosen to run 1 Air Knight and a second tribute monster instead, in order to present a more versatile array of threats as a way to deal with certain cards in the meta these days. So let's take a quick look at those, shall we? First up we have Jinzo, a 2400 attack machine that while being face up on the field negates all trap cards. If you've watched the anime, you're likely familiar with this card, and yes, he is just as powerful in this format as he was portrayed there. And no, I can't show you footage because I don't want to risk a copyright strike. Back when GOAT was top dog, with Chaos a close second, Jinzo wasn't as powerful, as neither deck ran an abundance of traps, and so giving up the extra card draw of a second Air Knight wasn't really worth it. However, as the format shifted in a more aggressive direction, with Warrior and Gravekeeper decks rising in response to Chaos decks, running more traps than ever with 3 copies of Solemn Judgment and Trap to Shoot, playing alongside GOAT staples. In addition to this, sometimes cited against GOAT matchups is Royal Command, a floodgate that negates all flip effects. As you'll see later in this video, flip effects are very important for this deck, as they allow us to maintain our card advantage over the course of the game. So having Jinzo around to negate Royal Command is very important. For those reasons, these days I usually run a single Jinzo along with a single Air Knight in my GOAT decks. Another card that sees some fringe play in both of this deck and decks with similar builds like Chaos is Chaos Command Magician. A very simple card, Magician has the effect of negating any monster effect that only targets him. Outside of a few field wipes, most removal in this format does target, as does any controlling effects like Snatch Steal. Plus, this card can't be sucked up by Thousand Eyes, which makes it a good wall to have up if you're under a Thousand Eyes lock, as it's unlikely Restrict will be able to run over it. I don't currently run this card in my deck due to lack of space, but it's one I may experiment with in the future, and I wouldn't fault you at all for trying one yourselves. Moving on from the biggest threats, let's take a look at the deck's level 4 and lower monsters, starting with one of my favourite cards of all time, Breaker the Magical Warrior. A 1600 attack spellcaster, Breaker comes into play with a spell counter on it. As long as he has this counter, he gains 300 attack points, and the counter can be removed to pop one of our opponent's back row. Again, if you've seen the anime, you're likely familiar with this card, as it was involved in one of the most famous scenes of all of Yugioh. And again, much like Jinzo, he's as good in the actual game as he was shown in the anime. What makes Breaker so good is how versatile this card is. With GOAT format being a format where most people don't set much back row out of fear of heavy storm, popping just one card can sometimes be enough to clear the way for an attack, meaning Breaker can in some cases help you win the game or save your board from the mirror force. However, if that's not needed, we can simply choose to leave the counter on him, leaving him as a 1900 attack beater that few 4-star monsters other than Berserk Gorilla can beat over. Next in our 4-star lineup, we have the field wipe on a body known as Tribe Infecting Virus. A 1600 attack water monster, the virus has the ability to destroy all monsters of any type at the cost of discarding 1 card from our hand. This is one of 2 ways we have of countering rival scapegoats, as discarding 1 card and naming beasts removes all 4 of the tokens from play, and that's often a pretty good deal. In addition to this card is a great way of dealing with big threats like the Chaos Monsters and Restrict, and can be a win condition if dropped at the right time, by wiping an opponent's entire board and swinging for the win. Along with Thousand Eyes, this card was banned shortly after GOAT format and remained banned even longer, only coming off the list in 2020. Was it banned way too long? Definitely. Does this show how terrifying this card was to fight back in the day? Oh yes. I mentioned that Tribe wasn't our only GOAT killer, so next up we have a Soda Priest, a spirit monster with 1700 attack points that can attack every monster in the opponent's field once each, and like all spirits, can be special summoned and returns to our hand at the end of the turn. As said, this is our other way of dealing with opposing scapegoats, as it can wipe them all out in 1 attack. Also, being a spirit makes it immune to non-quick play forms of removal, as it'll be back in your hand before a lightning vortex can hit it. Continuing with our spiritual journey, we have Tsukiyomi. Again, this is a card I've covered before in my Gravekeeper's video, but I will give it a full breakdown. In addition to the usual spirit effects, Tsuk has the ability of flipping down a monster on summon. Please note that this is not an optional effect, so be careful when you do use this card. Now, while this is a simple effect, it has many different uses in this format. Firstly, let's talk about how this card interacts with Thousand Eyes Restrict. Now, obviously this card can break a Restrict block by flipping an opponent's copy face down. However, it can also be used with our copy of Restrict in order to turn it into a removal effect. Since the card restricts steals or equips, they will be sent to the grave when he's flipped. So you can steal a monster, use Tsuk to flip it down, and then, provided this is not the same turn you played Restrict, you can then flip it back up and steal another monster. Outside of Restrict, Tsuk can be a powerful removal piece all by itself. This one card is the reason why Monarchs were never top tier in GOAT like they would be in later formats. As I pointed out last episode, many other level 4 staples in this format have 1,000 or less defense, which means that Tsuk can easily just flip them down and run them over, all by herself, while being very difficult to stop due to only being able to be hit by quick play effects and trap effects. The final and most important use for Tsukiyomi in this deck, however, is her interaction with flip effects, and her ability to reset them for repeated use. As we'll soon see, flip monsters are the backbone of this deck, as they how we maintain card advantage. So by using Tsuk on these cards, we can get extra uses of power spells with Magician of Faith, more card searching with Magical Merchant, and more card draw in general with Morphing Jar. GOAT Control is a very flexible deck, which can accommodate a full warrior package if we wish, that includes Exiled Force, DD Assailant and Reinforcement of the Army, but the one warrior I would suggest running regardless of your build is DD Warrior Lady. A warrior with 1500 attack points, DD Warrior Lady has the ability to banish any monster it battles. Like Tsuk, this can be used to outdo problematic monsters like BLS and Restrict, but one advantage Warrior has is she can't be run over by opponent Tsuks, and is strong enough to not die to King Tiger Wanghu, a card played in the strongest non-scapegoat deck, Anti-Meta Warriors. In addition to Tribe Infecting Virus, we play another powerful water monster in this deck, known as Abyss Soldier. An 1800 attack beater, the soldier has the ability of bouncing any card from the field to the opponent's hand by discarding a water monster. Now, while the effect may seem difficult to use at first, seeing as we only run 2 other water monsters in this deck, trust me, it's actually not, which we'll see soon enough. And while this card only bounces as opposed to removing cards, the fact that it can hit any card in the opponent's field, and the fact that this monster has the largest attack of any level 4 in this deck, not named Breaker with a spell counter on it, makes him a very powerful asset. I mentioned last time how bouncing can be a nightmare for Chaos and Monarch decks, as the resources they had to bring the monster up the first time may not exist for a second go around. However, this card goes even further by allowing us to bounce the stall cards used by Burn so we can attack them, and so it removes GOAT tokens from the game, as tokens vanish if they're placed anywhere but on the field. For our final non-flip effect monster, we have Sinister Serpent, a 300 attack level 1 monster that has the ability of returning from the graveyard to your hand each standby phase. Please note that this is the non-errated version of the card, so it will come back to your hand each turn. Now this card's most powerful use in this deck is in combination with Tribe, as it essentially gives us one free activation a turn. But this card also applies to other cards with discard effects that can be included in this deck, such as Arageki Break. This card also acts as a defense against hand attack like Delinquent Duo, and also has a potential repeatable defender that we can set each turn. Finally, being a level 1 monster, it's another target for Metamorphosis, meaning in addition to being a free Tribe activation, it's also a potential free Restrict. Next in our monster lineup, we have Sangan, a level 3 fiend that when sent from the field to the graveyard allows us to add any monster with 1500 attack or less from our deck to our hand. Now this can include removal monsters like Duty Warded Lady and Exiled Force, any of our flip effect monsters which I'll talk about in a little bit, and of course Sinister Serpent to deal with hand attack. As said, Go Control is one of the more versatile decks in this format, and Sangan allows us to find whatever card we need for any situation. For our final staple monsters, we run 3 powerful flip effects: Magician of Faith, Magical Merchant, and Morphing Jar. Being a control deck, our goal is for the game to go long, and for us to win by outgrinding our opponent with extra cards and more field presence. And our flip monsters are a big part of this. Let's begin with the most difficult of these to use properly, Morphing Jar. Morphing Jar is a level 2 monster that when flipped forces both players to discard their hands and draw 5 new cards. Now in a deck like this, where we always want to have a lot of resources, it's important that we keep our hand as full as possible to survive till the late game. So the ability to draw a whole new hand is obviously very powerful, but we have to be careful when using this card that we don't either push our opponents further ahead of us by filling their hand too much, and we also have to be cautious not to telegraph that we have a Morphing Jar because it's prime nobleman of crossout bait. So obviously I'd recommend only using this card when your opponent has more cards in hand than you do, or if your hand is awful. However, it is possible to set all your back row up with a Morphing Jar for even more advantage, but I'm not sure if I'd recommend this, as doing this leaves us vulnerable to Heavy Storm, and it also is like wearing a giant sun on your head saying, "I set a jar, please attack." Also, this is the worst of the flip monsters to pair with Tsukiyomi, as you aren't getting that much advantage from constantly reflipping this card, unless you're emptying your hand every turn. Next in our flip monsters, we have a Searcher in the form of Magical Merchant, a level 2 spellcaster that when flipped allows us to mill our deck until we find a spell card and add it to our hand. As we'll see in a little while, it's very rare we'll hit a spell in this deck that's useless at any point in the game, so that this card's already pretty powerful, often drawing us into more cards with Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity, or finding us a high impact card like Heavy Storm and Delinquent Duo. However, in addition to this, the fact that this card is a light monster that puts cards in our graveyard makes it a great way to turbo out our BLS. The only way this card could be even better would be if it was level 1 and could be used with Thousand Eyes Restrict. Speaking of which, finally and most importantly, we have Magician of Faith, a level 1 light spellcaster that upon being flipped lets us add any spell from our grave back to our hand. Now this effect's obviously pretty busted in this format, but before we even talk about that, let's discuss the other reason this card is so good. Being both a light monster and a level 1 monster means this is the only card in our deck that is both a Metamorphosis target for Thousand Eyes Restrict and a BLS material. But enough of that, let's discuss all the broken effects this card can give us a second use of. Here's a brief rundown of some of the cards Magician of Faith can provide us. It can give us 2 additional cards with Pot of Greed, potentially pick up to 4 cards from our opponent's hand with Delinquent Duo, gives us 2 Revivals with Premature Burial, 2 Thefts with Snatch Steal, and we can nuke our opponent's back row twice with Heavy Storm. Also, with both this card and Merchant, it's even better if combined with Tsukiyomi, allowing us to repeatedly use their effects and get even more card advantage. Now in a first for this series, we can take a look at the extra deck, or fusion deck as it was called back in the day. Now just know that we will never actually be fusion summoning in this deck, and this is just a deck of cards we can get using Metamorphosis. So let's do a quick rundown of each card and see what we may or may not want to summon. In the level 1 slot we of course have Thousand Eyes Restrict, which I've already covered. Moving up to level 3 we have Dragoness the Wicked Knight, a mediocre light vanilla. While this card is impressive, it does give us a way to trigger Sangan if needed and put a light in the graveyard for BLS. Next at level 4 we have Darkfire Dragon. Again, this one is useful if we want to put a dark monster in the grave for BLS, or if we need a little extra damage to finish a game when all we have is Tsukiyomi. Also being level 4 means we can use it to clear Snatch Steal monsters off our field. Moving on to level 5, We're actually against some good monsters here with Dark Bolter the Terrible and Fiend Skull Dragon. Dark Bolter has the ability to negate normal spells at the cost of 1000 life points, and also negates the effects of monsters it destroys, essentially making it both a mini Imperial Order and a mini Dark Ruler Hades. Fiend Skull Dragon isn't as oppressive in that it only negates flip monsters, but it also has the ability to negate any trap that targets it, making it more difficult to remove. Finally, we have Guilty of the Dark Knight, which is here for the same reason as Dragoness, and that it gives us another light to fill the grave for BLS. Moving on to the level 6 monsters, we often do not have access to these cards by ourselves, as Standard GOAT does not run any level 6 monsters, and even if we run some of the techs I've suggested, that only gives us an extra 2. So oftentimes we're relying on Snatch Steal to bring these monsters out. Still, they're worth talking about, because they're still pretty powerful. First up, completing the Legacy of Darkness trio, we have Ryu Senshi, a level 6 that negates the effects of a trap for 1000 life points, and is unaffected by spells that target him. This is pretty good because he can't be Snatch Stealed and can be Book of Mooned to make him easier to run over. Another level 6 we run is Dark Blade the Dragon Knight, which upon inflicting battle damage removes up to 3 monsters from an opponent's graveyard. Now obviously this is great against Chaos, as it's easy to use this to cut them off one of their attributes. However, another fringe use of this card can be against beasts, as most of their monsters can't run over this guy in battle, and the one who can, Bazoo the Soul Eater, requires removing 3 monsters to make him that strong, which this card makes extremely difficult. Finally, with our level 8s, as level 7s are so fringing GOAT, even with Snatch Steal there's no point in running them, we have Gatling Dragon, a 2600 attack machine that allows us to flip 3 coins once per turn, and destroy a monster for each heads. Not only is this card a potential field wipe, but it also works really well in combination with the revival cards, as BLS can be summoned from the grave once normal summoned, making Metamorphosis plus Premature Burial a potentially lethal combo with BLS. This will likely be the only time I cover the extra deck in full, as most extra decks in GOAT are the same, so from here on out I'll likely refer back to this video when talking about the extra deck, unless there is something specific to talk about in whatever deck I'm covering at the time. Next, let's look at the most important part of GOAT control, the spell cards. While the monsters in GOAT format are fairly powerful, they can't compare to how strong the spells of this deck are, with many of them still on the ban list to this day, and most unlikely to ever see the light of day again. Oftentimes, especially in GOAT mirrors, the game is often won and lost based on who managed to find the most broken spells, and how many times we managed to replay them with Magician of Faith. We've already covered the Scapegoat and Metamorphosis combo, which is the heart of this deck, so now let's look at the other half dozen broken cards we have access to. Let's begin by looking at the trinity of Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity and Delinquent Duo, 3 of the most powerful cards in the history of not just GOAT format, but the entire game. I usually brush over these cards in my GOAT guides, as the power is fairly obvious from just looking at them, but in this one, let's take a closer look at why they're so good. We'll begin with the card I have the least to say about, Pot of Greed. Probably the simplest effect in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! It draws us 2 cards, and that's it. Not much to say other than this is one of the most powerful effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! So powerful in fact that modern retrains of this card basically require a blood sacrifice to work. This is the card you'll often want to recur with Magician of Faith, as one of the best cards to see in your opening hand. Next up, we have one of my favourite cards in terms of both its effect and its art in the whole TCG, Graceful Charity, which allows us to draw 3 cards and then discard 2. Now, unlike Pot of Greed, this card doesn't actually generate card advantage, as we're losing 3 cards and then drawing 3 cards. However, the amount of card selection and follow-up plays this card offers us gives it a much higher potential ceiling than Pot of Greed. Firstly, it allows us to see more cards in our deck by digging 3 cards deep as opposed to 2, meaning you have more chance to find what you need for the current situation. And secondly, the discard gives you the chance to both set up BLS plays, set up spells in the graveyard for future use with Magician of Faith, and just set up a big threat with Premature Burial or Call of the Haunted. Charity and Pot were both banned around the time that GOAT ended, and over the years I'd say that Charity has become the more powerful of the two, with the game's increasing focus on graveyard strategies. Don't expect either of these cards to ever come off the ban list. For the final card of the Trinity, we have Delinquent Duo, which is actually the weakest hand attack card that came from the utterly broken selection in Spell Ruler, and thus was the only one not banned by this point. For the cost of 1000 life points, this card discards a random card from your opponent's hand and then forces your opponent to choose another card and discard that as well. Now, despite how much of an advantage this card can give us, I'd argue this is by far the weakest of the three. Firstly, unlike its banned brethren and even Trap Dust Shoot, we have zero control over what we discard. Secondly, this card has grown a lot worse since Chaos started taking over from Goat as the top deck, because it can be very easy to set up their grave for a Chaos play. And finally, out of all the power spells in this deck, this is the easiest to play around, with cards like Sinister Serpent and Regenerating Mummy. In fact, this is the only card out of the Trinity that I've seen some decks cut out in recent times. None of this means this card is bad, and against non-Chaos decks it can still be just as crippling as ever, but I definitely argue its best days are long behind it. Next in our broken spell lineup, we have Snatch Steal, an equip card that for the cost of giving our opponent 1000 life points a turn, allows us to take control of one of their monsters. First, let's up with the life point game, which really isn't much of a downside. Often when playing this deck, we're looking to get to the point where we have so many resources on such a dominating field that our win is inevitable, so our opponent having more life points than us really doesn't matter in that scenario. In terms of how we use Snatch Steal, there's three main uses. Firstly, to steal a monster for use with either Metamorphosis or as tribute fodder. The second is just to take a powerful beat stick like a Monarch, a high level fusion or a Bazoo. And thirdly is obviously to take control of a monster with a powerful effect like Thousand Eyes or a Chaos monster. Finally, in terms of broken spell cards, we have Heavy Storm, which has the ability to blow away all spell and trap cards from the field, and is another Goat staple that has been banned for many years due to its insane power level. Now, while a dark hole for back row is powerful for its self-evident reasons, I'd like to talk about not so much the effect that this card has on the game itself, but the effect that the fear of this card has on the game. Goat format is often a very slow format, with games taking between 10 and 20 turns, and this card is one of the chief reasons why, since it makes experienced players less likely to commit more than one back row at a time, out of fear of being 2 for 1 or worse. So in terms of how we use this card, we want to 1. Use it against decks that do have to commit more back row, like Burn. 2. Use it if we need to remove 1 or 2 powerful spells to traps, like Snatch Steal. Or 3. You need to clear the field and swing for game, which this card is very helpful in doing. In the same spirit as this, we also have Mystical Space Typhoon, a quick play spell that allows us to destroy one spell trap card on the field, which, while not as powerful as Heavy Storm, still has its uses in that it allows us to respond to our opponents playing back row on their turn during the end phase, and also helps us remove a equip from Restrict during battle, allowing us to blow it out. Also, it can be used as a pseudo-negate against continuous effects that need to stay on the field to activate. Also, like I said, many experienced Goat players don't set more than one back row at a time anyway due to Heavy Storm, so Mystical Space Typhoon can often give us similar results, especially if we need to get something like a Mirror Force off the board quickly. Next up in our spell lineup is Premature Burial, and while we're at it, let's also include the trap card Call of the Haunted, as they're both very similar. Both of these cards have abilities that can search a monster from our graveyard and put it back onto the field. With that monster reborn, these are our best ways to bring back our big threats in the graveyard. In terms of good targets, we have Tribe Infecting Virus, our good fusion monsters, Airnight Parshath, or the other tributes we may include in this deck, and of course BLS. Please keep in mind that you need to summon BLS the proper way first, before you can be brought back from the graveyard. If used correctly, these cards can also have us dump one of our big threats onto the table very early in combination with cards like Graceful Charity and Magical Merchant. The one downside of these cards is that they turn our opponent's backroom removals into 2 for 1s at worst, as destroying these cards also destroys the monster they bring back. To finish off our spell lineup, we have Book of Moon and Nobleman of Crossout. As I said in my Gravekeeper's video, Book of Moon works in a very similar way to Tsukiyomi, and has many of the same utilities, including resetting flip effects, shutting down Thousand Eyes locks, turning our Thousand Eyes into a removal card, and putting low defense monsters face down so we can run them over. However, in addition to this, because it's a quick play spell, it can be played on our opponent's turn, this card has the advantage of being able to flip powerful monsters face down to prevent their attacks. Also, this card combos with the final spell of the deck, Nobleman of Crossout. Nobleman of Crossout is a normal spell that banishes a face down monster, and if that monster happens to be a flip effect monster, Nobleman will remove all the copies from the game. With flip effect monsters being the backbone of many Goat decks, having this card extract every copy of a single card can be devastating, So for example, removing all Gravekeeper's spies from a Gravekeeper's deck could absolutely cripple the deck, as can removing a bunch of jar cards from empty jar. However, this card, you have to be careful when using it in Goat mirrors, because if you remove a Magician of Faith or Magical Merchant, it can be just as damaging to your deck as your opponent's. Finally, moving on to the trap cards, let's begin with one of the most famous cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Mirror Force. Again, this is a card, if you're familiar with the anime, you'll have heard of, and even if you're not, if you're familiar with YugiTube, you'll likely have seen the Mirror Force trust issues memes. Mirror Force is a battle trap, which means a trap that can only be activated when an attack is declared, and upon flipping it, it destroys all your opponent's monsters in attack position. Again, much like Heavy Storm, the potential blowout of this card can cause games to slow right down, with many players only committing one attacking monster at a time out of fear of a blowout, which is the reason that grindier decks like Goat and Chaos have topped this format for so long. Again, like many of the other cards on this list, Mirror Force spent a good amount of time post-Goat on the ban list, and while it will no longer be good by today's standards, veteran players like myself still have bad memories of this card in its prime. Moving on from Mirror Force, we play 1 to 3 copies of Sikaretsu Armor. Like Mirror Force, Armor is a battle trap that destroys a monster upon activation. Now sometimes this card will do the exact same job as Mirror Force if our opponent hasn't committed much to the field, but other times if your opponent is playing an aggressive deck, or we've already expended our Mirror Force, we may need to pick a choice of which monsters we use this card on. In which case, we use this card to kill any monster that is capable of delivering a killing blow if we're low on life, and on a big threat at other times. This includes the obvious suspects like Restrict and BLS, but can also be used on massive beaters like Berserk Gorilla and Bazoo the Soul Eater, or goat killers like Asura Priest. Next, complementing Mystical Space Typhoon and Heavy Storm, we're in a pair of Dust Tornadoes. On the surface, this card is just a weaker Mystical Space Typhoon, as it can't be played the turn you draw it, and its second ability of allowing us to set a back row after activation doesn't seem very useful at first glance. We covered the usefulness of the first effect in the Typhoon section, so let me now show you how this second effect can be used. Firstly, this effect works well in combination with Morphing Jar. Like I said, when playing Morphing Jar, ideally you don't want to just set Jar and a bunch of back row, as it's very obvious to an experienced player what you're doing. With Dust Tornado, you can set one card and leave another one in your hand, then chain it to Jar's activation, setting the other card before your hand is discarded. Doing this allows us to better mask our play, and makes it less likely that our opponent ruins it with one Noble Man of Crossout. In addition to this, Tornado can be used to save a card in your hand from hand attack cards like Delinquent Duo and Trap to Shoot, by setting them in response to them. For some non-battle trap removal, we play Ring of Destruction. A normal trap, Ring can destroy any monster on the field, and then subtract that monster's attack points from both players' life points. Now obviously this is a powerful effect because unlike most single target removal traps in this format, it doesn't require a cost like a discard. However, don't underestimate how much damage this card can do. Combined with one of the deck's big beaters like Blacklisted Soldier, this card can easily finish off an opponent out of nowhere, and even cause OTKs in rare instances. Finally, in terms of staples, we have Torrential Tribute. A normal trap, Tribute activates upon the summoning of any monster, and it destroys all monsters on the field. A powerful card that in fact still sees play today in decks like Burning Abyss, Torrential Tribute is much like Mirror Force in that it discourages players from playing too many monsters in fear of a blowout. However, unlike Mirror Force, we have a bit more control over when the field wipe happens, as any summon can trigger this card. This means that we can not only use this card to clear our opponent's board, but set it up so we gain more card advantage with cards like Sangan and Sinister Serpent. I'd also like to point out that this is the first deck I've made on this channel that doesn't include either Trap Dust Shoot or Solemn Judgment, which are more aggressive cards. Now with Trap Dust Shoot you could play that card if you have the space for it, I just choose not to. However, with Solemn Judgment, I would argue that the cost is not worth it in this deck, as even though Judgment can stop one card for free, losing around 4,000 life points puts us at risk of dying quickly to aggressive decks, or falling behind other control decks like Goat and Chaos. Now these are the traps seen in most Goat control decks, and indeed many Goat decks in general. However, there are some techs you can consider. First up is Divine Wrath, a counter trap that for the cost of discarding one card, negates the effect of a monster and destroys it. While this card is a -1, In terms of card advantage, it's a great way to stop a chaos monster or powerful flip monster. If the deck needs more monster removal for outside the battle phase, another card we can run with a discard cost is Raigeki Break, which pops one card on the field at the cost of one card from your hand. Again, neither of these cards are seen that often, but especially in combination with the Serpent, they can be excellent surprises that an opponent may not expect. As always, when it comes to side decking, it's very flexible depending on your meta, but some cards I'd recommend include Trap Does Shoot. Like I said, there's not much room to main this card, but against certain decks that play a lot of back row, this card can be really good to side in. 7 Duels with a Bandit. Keep in mind, this deck's biggest opponent will be aggressive decks that play a lot of trap cards, so having this to stop something like Solemn Treatment is very important. Also, Creature Swap can be a good card for this deck, as exchanging a Scapegoat for a BLS is so good. Other than that, you can possibly play a second Abyss Soldier for extra removal. And if we need more back row hate, Mobius the Frost Monarch can be a good sideboard for something like Air Knight Parshaf. In conclusion, while no longer top dog of the format, Go Control is still a very fun and very powerful deck that's capable of hanging with the top tier contenders. It's a deck that will likely not lose its appeal to a player for a while due to how different each game can be, and like I said, it's one of the best mirror matches of all time. While currently out of top contention, I fully expect this deck will someday climb back to number 1 as Go format adapts to the current reign of Chaos and Warriors. But if that never happens, I'll still be playing my GOAT deck both online and in paper for many years to come. Thank you all for watching, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.